This week is officially the first week where I have completed every single essay. Every single essay from my course, and I can't say that I, haven't enjoyed those overwhelming times, despite having to struggle in pushing myself in writing those essays. I nevertheless enjoyed what I have learned, the content that I have that were discussed throughout the course that led to the topic of the essay. And so this week I'll be focusing on the topic for my final essay, which is race as a moral issue. So the task for this essay was to pick two authors and summarize their main ideas and conceptions about their understanding of race, and how that relates to their theological dispositions. So basically what I'm going to do is to actually read while also putting in my personal opinions on the essay that I've written on race. And of course, even though I have inserted the dialogues and the conceptions of these two authors, Willie James Jennings, an African American who wrote the book The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, and the second author, Martin Luther King Jr. Well, in this case, it's not the primary text, so it was written by two authors who reviewed basically his writings, King's writings, and the title of the book was The Prophet of Discontent, and the Critique of Racial Capitalism. So here we already know that there are two conceptions as to how the idea of race is encapsulated. So the first one, race, the Christian Imagination, Willie James Jennings focuses mainly on how the concept of race is a new identity formed from the European narrative. So the blacks, the African Americans having to, originally they had to buy into this system of slavery, and they were pushed to work. They only had to combine into that narrative in order for the European colonists to visualize the new kingdom of heaven, or Christ on earth, which is to have all these other minor races and combine and work together to visualize, to actualize this dream, this new race, which is the new European identity. So I'm just going to give a brief description of what race means. So essentially, race is a term that simply refers to breed. It refers to breed, but it generally comes under the classification of peoples into a group, usually under a shared nation, customs, culture, ancestral heritage, of course. But to talk about race in an individual understanding is to identify people people belonging to a certain race via their specific features, their bodily gestures, their emotional qualities that are indicative of their race, so to speak. But of course, a more simpler understanding of race is an ethnic group. So now we know that the concept race is summarized into a larger scale of people who held different attitudes, customs, language, and beliefs. Even the Bible, of course, in the Old Testament, if you've read it, encapsulate a lot about race and people with different customs. So for example, the custom for the Israelites to do a long wail when they mourn of their beloved's death is like the story in John 11 verse 33, the story of Lazarus' death and his sisters weeping over his death, and others weeping over his death, wailing with her as well. And the second custom is having to commemorate this warrior called Jephthah the Gileadite, by the daughters of the Israeli men. That was in the book of Judges 11:39 to 40. So people belonging to different sorts of races have different attitudes, different customs, and not all of them can agree into many things, of course, as we already know. There are conflicts when people try to form a common understanding, but there are just these little intricacies which hinder these two nations, or more than two nations, to understand each other. But of course, the term race now, in the modern sense, has been understood as somewhat of a social construct. And that is usually derived from an emotional connotation. When somebody harbors some angst, for example, like African Americans harboring angst towards the American, European colonists, So that's sort of, depending on how you look at it, people who have this, people who form their culture and wanting a similar kind of people to merge in that culture can be called a preservation of their exclusivity, racial exclusivity, or racial purity, if you want to put it that way. But of course, this racial purity, the sense of racial exclusivity, can turn out to be toxic. People can sort of just look at it and view that, these are people who are tribalist and they do not want to conform to the new order because they want to isolate themselves, and they're opposed to change, and so on and so forth. So, of course, throughout history, we know that the Roman Church, for example, is exclusive in the manner that only people who are perhaps, able to, I don't know about this accurately, don't quote me on this, but people who are able to, I suppose, join the mass. Of course, I mean people of the working class at the time. For example, let's say Martin Luther's time, they were able to join in the mass session. But of course, I mean, just purely looking at it from a reality has nothing to do with race. It's only when people view it as exclusive, as something that's not at all inclusive to people who are, for example, refugees and people from all sorts of class. That's why there's the churches here, Church of St. Paul and the Unitarian Church in Melbourne, Australia. They're welcoming people, refugees, people from sort of a disadvantage. But of course, as I said here in my document, throughout history, the attempt to create racial exclusivity had been done through the means of religious, political, or social conformity by a higher institution. But those who dared to challenge or conform, or not conform to the particular set of values offered by that institution, were subject to extermination or segregation. Now, Martin Luther is a good example because he was, in the end, he wasn't executed, but he was excommunicated because he dared to challenge the church, the teachings of the Catholic Church. So he was challenging the big institution at the time, which was the Roman Church. So he was segregated, but he, of course, had the protection of Elector of Saxony, Frederick. So he was still given around, I think, 60 days to recant, to decide whether he would recant his treatises. Treatises is like sort of like a polemic, anti-heretical works, that he encapsulated to attack the church. So Willie Jennings is an African American, of course, and he was raised in Baptist church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, along with his relatives, his mother and his grandmother, who used to be slaves for the American Europeans there. So in his work, he highlighted the sort of like this feeling of strangeness, this idea of isolation that was present within his own neighborhood at the start of his chapter, where he mentioned that there was a separate congregation of Reformed European Christians who were, well, Europeans, and he sort of tried to highlight the strangeness in accent, speech, and the way that these Europeans interacted with Africans, Christians, which seemed foreign, formal. The idea that this is just pure racial subjugation because of the historical reality that the blacks were enslaved. So there is according to Timothy T.N.'s review of Jennings wanted to convey the message that there was and there has been an inherent supersessionistic view. So supersessionism means the idea that the eternal kingdom of salvation can only be fulfilled via entering the covenant with Christ, hence replacing the Mosaic covenant, which was inherited by the Jews. And Jennings was not trying to say that the Africans in this sense are representing the Jews, but what he is essentially trying to convey is how everybody, including the African Americans, in this sense, has to fit into this supersessionistic view of the dominant European narrative in order for the Africans to be saved. So when they adopt into this Western identity, probably through education, through preaching, entering ministry of the Calvinist college, which Jennings did in his youth, the Africans gradually adopted the rationalities that contribute to the knowledge and identity formation of the Western world. Hence, this to him is the projection of the Christian social imagination, where the participation in the narration of a Christian identity requires an adherence to the new order and the sacrifice of the past. But it is not just that. In one of the chapters, Jennings mentioned an African's former slave boy called Equiano. Equiano traveled around a lot inside a slave cargo ship, just contained into this narrow confines of the ship. But the only thing that he could do was to expose himself to the domestic form of literacy at the time, which was the Bible. He managed to learn English, speak English, write in English, and then eventually translate the African Bible into English, because that was the colonial domestic language at the time. So there was certainly an attempt. At this time, the African lands was being colonized by the British. This is not America. This is a different story. So there's this new form of persona or subjectivity, which is the European subjectivity that was. I won't use the word contaminated, but if you want to use that word, you can. That had been contaminated into the African mindset. So, assimilation, entering into a social imagination, is the only way for these Africans to seek salvation. Cultural salvation. individual and collective salvation. Hence, the experience of becoming a Christian cannot be formed without the reference to British colonialism. Now, this is because Jennings noticed and he highlighted that there is a disconnection of land with identity. Author Mark Rose proclaimed that the purpose of colonialism is to sever the ties of land with identity. And when that has been achieved, race fills the gap. Race becomes the marker of identity, which predicates how one looks and behaves, rather than where one is from. The Native African people, who initially bore the subjective conception of Africanness, were then forced to be moved economically and intellectually in accordance with the colonial British system. Hence the start of their new, hence Christian narrative bearing the identity of whiteness. Now, that says a lot, doesn't it? The disconnection of land. That is important. I think that phrase is important to highlight. In the Bible, God talks a lot about land, about how the Israelites would be blessed with lands, Abraham. The covenant that God made with Abraham in the Old Testament, where he would conquer all nations, and hence they were gonna be inherited by his descendants, Isaac and Jacob, so forth and so forth. So there is certainly something scriptural about this, about how, these Christian European missionaries wanted to establish this order, seeking salvation through having these people, the Africans, who initially bore their native customs and religions, which to them were, I suppose, considered a bit invalid. In order for them to take up the cross of Christ, suffer under the premise of slavery, of capitalism, the harsh treatment of capitalism, which I will discuss later on, in order to combine into this new European narrative, or race for that matter, hence bearing a new identity. I hope that makes sense. So yes, he went on further in his work, describing the Portuguese mission of Prince Henry, with his appointed chronicler Zurara, in Lagos, Africa, trying to seize the Africans taken captive and tortured in order to attain and emulate the crucifixion of Christ. So there is not only that there is an element of a formation into this new identity through the suffering of the cross, by sacrificing your initial, perhaps heathen, I'm sorry to say, like heathen practices into the true religion at the time. So this was kind of similar to Christ, because in the way that Christ was taken in front of to Pontius Pilate, and then his punishment was conducted under the power of the Roman state, right? By the Roman guards. And there were witnesses, of course, many witnesses, and this is parallel to what was going on in the story of the Portuguese, the capture of Lagos in Africa by the Portuguese missionaries. So it comes to a point where we question what it means. What does it mean to bear a Christian identity? Is it a result of having to assimilate into something in order for one to become a Christian? can you be Christian without associating it with the European narrative? I mean, initially, Christianity came from the Middle East. It didn't spring up, well, previously in the glorious Rome. The Gnostic or polytheistic religions dominated Rome, the Roman Empire, until this new sort of like anti-polytheistic, monotheistic religion called Christianity sprang up. It was regarded as a heresy at the time for you to believe that there was a Messiah, that there's only one God, one true God, and this Messiah being the incarnate of this God to save humanity, to save the world from chaos, from sin, from suffering. So, when does this dysphoria supposedly spring up? How do people formulate this conception or this interpretation that Christianity is derived from? Christianity cannot be formed under the premise of European cultural context. Well, as we have read in Willie Jennings, that is a complete misunderstanding. It is a social imagination. There's one author called Michael Barkun who actually brought up the devil's seed theory that sprang in Britain in the 1920s, but then was developed in the 1960s, known as the devil's seed theory. So Michael Barkun highlighted that the Jews, they were the descendants of the offspring Cain, the cursed offspring Cain, while the Anglo-Saxons, the Nordics, the Germanics, they were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, initially when I read this, I was genuinely amused, even though eventually I just thought, well, maybe I should be amused because this was serious. You know, this really angered a lot of people when they read this article of the devil's seed theory. Yeah, so as for now, I think I will stop here, but hold on to that thought and let me know what you think in the comments, because there will be a part 2 to this where I will discuss Martin Luther King Jr. On race as a form of social and economical exploitation. So yeah, I don't want this video to be very long, so I'll divide it into 2 parts. Thank you. Peace out.